In this lecture, I'll talk about client-server model and how you could connect to your Raspberry Pi. So running the SSH client. So if you want to connect to another machine with SSH, Secure Shell, you got to run the client. Now right now, for this, I'm going to assume that we're using a Linux machine to run the client on. Now that counts for, so you could do this from Raspberry Pi, which is running Linux, Raspbian is Linux. Do this on an LX terminal. Or you could do this on any Linux machine. You can type in the same thing. Or you can also type into, if you were running a Mac, if Mac OS, because it is a Linux, you just start the terminal, run the terminal program, and you can type into that terminal. So any of those machines, this would be exactly the same procedure. If you're running on Windows, then probably depending on which secure shell you're using, like say you're using Putty, P-U-T-T-Y, if you download that one. If you run that, then it's a little bit different because you basically, to start running the program, you double click on the program. It opens up a little window and then you type in the same information, username, domain name, all that, but it just looks different depending. But right now I'll talk about if you're doing it on a Linux machine or a Mac OS machine. So you type in the following command, SSH, which is the name of the program, then you give a username and then and then a domain name. So the username is your username on the server machine. Right? Whatever your username is on the server, you put that there. That's to the left of the @ To the right of the @ you give the domain name. That's the mnemonic, the address for the for whatever the server machine's name is. So for instance, that might be uci.edu. That's what I want to connect to. Now note that you have to have a domain name, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, right? But you have to have a domain name or some alternative, or just an IP address. We'll talk about that. But this is normally how you use it. So you give the domain name. Now the first time you connect to a particular domain, so say I'm on Raspberry Pi and I'm connected to my machine in my office. The first time I make the connection, it'll give what looks like an error. It'll say that the address could not be authenticated. It always does that the first time you do the connection. Because it wants to, once you do it the first time, once you successfully do it the first time, it will record that address and you won't get that comment again. But the first time, it'll say that the address could not be authenticated. So if that, and then it'll ask you, are you sure you want to make the connection? So if you know that address is correct, so if you know uci.edu, let's say, is where you actually want to connect to, then you type yes and hit enter and it'll continue. And it'll remember that for the next time. It stores it in a file. Now then it'll prompt you for the password, right? So you'll type in whatever the password is. And after you type in the password, you'll see exactly what you would see if you were sitting at the machine. So which will eventually be a prompt. You'll get a command line prompt, a $, or whatever the prompt looks like, and you can type in your commands. So that's basically what you expect to happen. So let me show you what it looks like when I did it. So I did this from Raspberry Pi. So I went to Raspberry Pi, opened up LX terminal, and you can see at the top I've circled in red my command. So I said secure shell SSH Harris at openlab.ics.uci.edu. So that's a machine that I can connect to. So it says the authenticity of the host could not be verified, could not be established, it says. So that's always what it says first time. So it tells me the RSA key fingerprint, which I have blanked out in red because you don't need to see that. That's my fingerprint. But then it asks me, are you sure you want to continue connecting? So I type yes. You can see that I circled it in red. Then it says, okay, it's permanently added to my list, Then notice that under that it says password, Harris at openlab.ics.uci password. So there I typed in the password. Now you don't see the password, that's invisible, doesn't show it on the screen. I typed it in and I hit return. Then all the lines under that are what appears whenever I log into that machine, OpenLab. That's the stuff that just appears on the screen. And you can't see it because I didn't have enough space, but after a bunch of garbage that it prints at the top, eventually I get a command line, just a regular prompt, like a $bill prompt, and I can just type into the machine and it would be, it's as if I'm sitting at OpenLab's machines connected. Okay? So this is basically how it goes. And then I can execute commands remotely. So with Raspberry Pi has a secure shell server. So if you want to connect to the Raspberry Pi remotely, it's useful to connect to Raspberry Pi without the keyboard and monitor and all that. Actually, I use it now a lot to use my Raspberry Pi. So SSH server is running by default on your Raspberry Pi, so you don't have to do anything. You just power it up and it'll be running. You should change the private host ID keys. Okay. Now, what happens, and we don't want to get too much into into how authentication is performed, because that's a little out of the scope of the class. But there are these private host ID keys, and when you get your Raspberry Pi and install Raspbian on it, you get these default keys, which are the same as everybody else's default keys. So the problem is if you keep using those default keys, everybody else knows those keys, so you can have what's called a man-in-the-middle attack. Somebody can listen to your conversation if they wanted to, can decrypt your communication. So, so what you should do is before you start using the Secure Shell server on your Raspberry Pi, you should execute the following command there. All that command, it goes on one line. I just couldn't fit it on one line on the screen, but that's one long command that you execute to get a new set of keys. So you just execute that, and then you can, and even without executing that, you can connect to your Raspberry Pi Secure Shell server, but you should, for safety's sake, you should do that before the first time you connect. Thank you.